Okay, we are in the book of Judges. We are closing out the life of Samson. And in a way, this is sort of going to be the last judge that Judges is going to talk about. Samuel, technically, who writes the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, is the last judge. But as far as the book of Judges is concerned, there's just a few chapters left. Samson is kind of the last judge that's spoken of. Now, I don't know if this was popular afterwards, but in the 80s, there used to be this group that would go to schools, and public schools even, called the Power Team. And these are big, strong guys who do these amazing feats of strength, like they'd bend frying pans and do all kinds of tear apart chains and stuff like that. And this is a Christian group, and they would say that this is, they're not doing it in their own strength, but the strength that God has provided. That was kind of the spiel. And I think it was funny now looking back on it that they would often refer to Samson, because Samson is like the strong man of the Bible, and that his strength came from the Lord. This is not any dig at them. I don't know if they still do their thing. I hope they do, because it was they would do this in public schools. It'd be a gospel message by these big, tough guys. But one thing that they really never talked about or reenacted was the death of Samson and the humiliation of Samson. And it's not that they were not humble men. I think all of them, to me at least as a kid, they seemed like earnest, godly men. But in a way, it would miss some of the point of Samson to only focus on his strength and not his humility. Because, as we're going to see this afternoon, the greatest thing he offers to us is not a lesson in strength, but a lesson in humility. Now, we left off Judges chapter 16 last week with verse 21. He had been taken captive because of the wiles of Delilah. As someone pointed out, text doesn't say he was actually married to her, so not even sure if she was his wife, but she was his love. She betrays him, turns him over to the Philistines, and this is what they do. Verse 21 of Judges 16. The Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. So here is Samson brokenhearted, not only because of Delilah, but really his own pride and ego has brought him to this place. He's captured by the Philistines, the constant, persistent enemy of the Israelites. If you're seeing the word Gaza there and thinking of the Gaza that's in the news lately, yes, it is the same area, but the Philistines as a people no longer exist. The people that live in Gaza right now are not descended from the ancient Philistines. It's a different group of people that are also still hostile to Israel. It has to do with the nature of the geography, God's plan. We'll get a little bit to that today, and actually a little bit to that in a few weeks, Sunday morning. But that is the same area of land, Gaza, as you would see on a map today. Now his eyes are gouged, he's bound in shackles, and he's doing this very menial labor of grinding grain. This is supposed to be the judge and savior of the Israelites. It'd be like seeing one of the power team members as a weak, homeless person that's on drugs and just off to the side, and you would just feel sorry for him. If I'd seen him, before and as a kid, as this big, strong man doing all these things for the Lord, and then suddenly to come across him on the side of the road, homeless and beggarly and poor, it's that kind of picture. And even more so because Samson was supposed to be not just a big, strong guy, but the savior of the Israelites from Philistine oppression. But here he is in this judgment and in this punishment. But there is grace and purpose in this punishment. His eyes are gouged, which is a cruel and harsh penalty. And yet, if you remember, it was Samson's lustful eye and heart that were the source of so many of his problems. So you think of Jesus saying, I've heard that it was said that if you commit adultery, right, you've sinned. But I tell you, if anyone looks at a woman to lust after her, he's committed adultery in his heart. And then he says, it's better for you to gouge out your eye and enter the kingdom of heaven than to enter hell with all of your parts, so to speak. You can't help but think of this kind of idea. yes, his eyes are gone, but Samson, your eyes were kind of the problem. If he could not see the beautiful Philistine women that he so often lusted after, maybe he could have avoided some of the temptation. There's a little bit of grace in his eyes being gouged out. And in fact, now with his physical eyes blinded, maybe the grace and the purpose was so that he could focus his spiritual eyes and finally see himself and his situation the way God sees it. The bronze shackles around his wrists were a reminder of all the times. Remember, the text said over and over again, when he was bound with a rope, he tore them off like molten wax. It's just easy for him to break out of these. So when it focuses on the wrists here, you're supposed to think back to the rest of the story. All the time, he just easily broke off these ropes and things that had bound him. And if Samson still had his strength, you might think that even this bronze would have just melted off his wrists like hot wax, and he could have snapped them off. But finally, his hands are trapped. But maybe, perhaps, he would realize that his arrogance in the past came at the cost of freedom. And there's no pride to be found in being a prisoner of your own actions. See, he thought he had the freedom to do whatever he wanted. And so anything that tried to restrain him, he could break. But that's not true freedom. That was just his own arrogance. And now he could make a greater connection between his arrogance and being a prisoner. But he could be free if he wanted to, if he embraced God's purpose. I think he remembered that to be a judge of Israel meant that he would have to be a slave of the Lord. But there's more freedom in being a slave of the Lord than being a slave to your own temptations and lusts. He's reduced to this very basic menial labor of just grinding grain, which was probably, because he's blind, he can't do a whole lot, but just taking a mortar and pestle and grain and just grinding it to make flour. It's a very menial task. It's fit for slaves and prisoners. You got the feeling, right, throughout Samson's life that this was a man who used his strength very flippantly. So whenever he had a chance to, he's using it without any thought. And now his great strength was reduced to doing this very mundane labor. And for who? For what? For his enemies. He's doing the most basic kind of weak labor that a kid could do, and he's doing it for the sake of his enemies. It's a very humbling kind of position. But perhaps in doing that labor, he had a moment to acknowledge that his strength had always come from the Lord, and its purpose had always been to serve God. Maybe he could remember as he's grinding this grain, I had great strength once, but I used it for myself. I was supposed to use it for the Lord. And so I do think this is a purposeful punishment. I think there is grace, even in the situation and circumstance he is. And as it says there, his hair was growing. And that's not necessary to say, like some mystical thing, like his hair and his strength were directly correlated. The idea of saying that his hair began to grow again is as a sign of God's grace and mercy, and a foreshadowing that God's purpose for Samson was not over yet. It's not mystical, the hair. It's a sign of his commitment to the Lord. It's growing, and God's favor and mercy is on him, and he's not done with him yet. We move on, and the table is being set here, literally in front of the Philistines, but also for another lesson. You could say that Samson is this example of pride coming before fall. But here, finally, we'll see that the pride of the Philistines will come before the roof falls on their head. Judges 17:23. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us. And when their hearts were merry, they said, call Samson, that he may entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the two pillars. And Samson said to the young man who held him by the hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. It was common for a conquering nation to claim that their God was better than the other guy's God that you defeated. But Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the real God of the universe, he didn't follow the ways of the other nations. He is greater than every other so-called God. But there were times when he allowed other nations to be the instruments of his discipline. In other words, it's not the case that Dagon was actually the greater God over Yahweh, and that Yahweh, he screwed up, he zigged when he should have zagged, he bobbed when he should have weaved, and he got knocked out by this other pagan god, and now he's kind of regrouping, he's going to go for a rematch, he's going to win this time. No. God always is the winner. But there are times when he allows these other nations to be instruments of his discipline. And this was promised over and over again. You can look, I referenced it this morning. Deuteronomy 28 gives all of these cursings for their disobedience, the disobedience of the Israelites. And one of them is that other nations would come against you. It's not that God was weaker than those gods. It's just that if you were going to chase after those gods, then you're going to be subject to those other gods. They're going to be over you. It's going to seem like I lost, but that's not the case. It's you lost, and I'm letting you feel the consequences, that those gods are not better to you than I am. And so that's why the Philistines are in charge right now. Now, this is the first mention of this god, Dagon or Dagon. See, I was researching this, and maybe he's the god of grain, possibly. Maybe it has to do with the fact that he's, grinding grain. A lot of scholars go back and forth on these sorts of things. They do etymology. What is the root of dag? What does it mean fish? There's some pictures of like a merman, like bottom half fish, top half a man, and maybe that's Dagon. He's all these things. We don't know, and it doesn't necessarily matter. He's just another pagan god. But he was prominent, and he was probably borrowed from another culture that the Philistines thought, well, that god is bringing them victory, so maybe we should worship that god. He culturally appropriated some other god, you could say. It doesn't necessarily matter. It's trying to give you, okay, he's the god of the grain, and he comes from, this pantheon of gods, and actually people don't know. It's ancient history. No one worships Dagon anymore. So in any case, this is the first mention. What's more important is this comment that I think MacArthur kind of succinctly puts. He says, "It is tragic when a person's sin contributes to the unsaved community giving praise to a false god, for God alone is worthy of praise." It's very shameful that because of Samson's actions, unbelievers are praising some foreign god. That is a shameful place to be in. And of course, we can see from their perspective why they're so excited and why they are partying, because they can't believe they finally subdued Samson. This was the guy who they had almost trapped in a city of the Philistines. They laid an ambush, and he picked up the entire gate and door of the town and walked with it on his back 40 miles like a turtle, and kept them from ambushing him. They couldn't stop him. He's the man who killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. They couldn't stop him. So the fact that he's been a thorn in their side, almost unstoppable, and for 20 years, they've just had to put up with Samson being a judge in Israel and having kind of a relative peace. They never forgot for all those years the embarrassment and shame that Samson had put on them, and they are so happy to finally catch him. And of course, they want to praise their God, so they throw a party, they're drunk, they're full of merriment. They make a decision that they would not live very long to regret. They summon Samson to entertain them, thinking that this is a beaten, defeated, humbled husk of a man. Or to entertain, it really is just to laugh at someone in this condescending, disdainful way, to scoff, to have fun at someone else's expense. He was going to be a spectacle to them. Like, listen, if you like, politics meter, I'll put it to like 1 here. Like this morning, I switched it on a little bit. But we should not want to see people be made a spectacle of. or be embarrassed in front of a whole group of other people. You should not necessarily cheer when someone is being made fun of, a public spectacle in that way. You should feel sorry if that ever happens. So there should be no glory or delight in having fun at someone else's expense. I'll just put it that way, okay? You can imagine the mockery, the jeering, the jokes made at Samson's expense. This great, powerful, authoritative man who's the judge, now seeming to be a shadow and husk of himself. And it's their pride. It's their pride that would do this, that would put them in a position where they are making fun of someone else. They're delighted that a proud and strong man was in such a pitiful estate. And this is what it means. If you ever wonder, this comes across a lot in the prophets, but if you ever see kind of the phrase that God is going to make someone a byword, like B-Y-W-O-R-D, it's this idea of someone becoming so iconic, almost like a meme, that they represent folly or foolishness. So when God says, I will make Israel a byword or Judah a byword, it's like saying that your failure is going to be such a public spectacle, everyone's going to make a meme of you and use you as the example of how God hates someone, right? That's kind of what's happening here is Samson is this parable now to them, a living parable of the failure of a person and the failure of his God. And that's what's entertaining to them. Now, it should not be the kind of thing that entertains us, but Samson is planning his own entertainment. One last finale show. He asks a boy to lead him to the pillars that were holding up the roof of the building. Now, interesting note here is in the 70s, they found a Philistine temple near Tel Aviv. And again, the whole coastline was like Philistine territory. It goes from Tel Aviv down through Gaza. And so they found actually a couple of, and I think by now they've found 3 Philistine temples, and there's a unique feature of them that in the middle, there are 2 central pillars upon which the roof rests that are about 6 feet apart, okay? Like you can see the layout of it. That's what they look like. So we found these like in the 70s. So it's confirmation, of course, 70 years later that they did design Philistine temples in this way. Now, it would be great to find the temple in Gaza that maybe Samson himself had knocked down, right? You're not going there right now to check for temples, or you'll find lots of ruins there right now. Unfortunately, there's no way to check there. But they surmised that if they were able to look around, they could find perhaps even this very temple. What's interesting is they dated these temples to exactly the time frame of Samson. Like, when did the Philistines have this authority and power that they're making all these temples? The 1200 to 1000 BC. Well, that's the period of Judges. So just another one of those archaeological corroborations of the Bible. Now, I will say this. The temples that they found were not very large. In fact, the temples they found were about as big as our auditorium here. So when it says that there was 3,000 men and women, I mean, this, maybe we could fit, if we added a roof to this, a flat roof, which the, Middle Eastern houses and temples had flat roofs. I think 1,000 would be pretty cramped. You know what I'm saying? There's no way. So the way that might get reconciled, and again, since we don't have the ruins of the temple in Gaza to double check, there's a couple different possibilities for this. I don't want to get too deep into it because it's kind of an archaeology thing, but I found it fascinating because it corroborates the story here. Either the structure in Gaza was much bigger, that still had 2 central pillars because that was their thing, and you can imagine that they would have had more pillars, but of course if you take down these 2 middle ones like dominoes, right, it'll just kind of keep collapsing. So either the temple in Gaza was much bigger, still featuring 2 central pillars as like a design feature and the domino effect of them all going down, or there's a possibility that the word 1,000, when it says 3,000, that the word 1,000 is being used in a specialized way, maybe talking about 3 different groups of important people, because all the lords are there. So maybe it's like 3 classes, 3,000 class people, you could say, that were there. I think there was a ton of people there. I think it was a much bigger temple than the ones they found near Tel Aviv. But we don't know until we do the archaeological dig. At the very least, there is very good reason to believe the historical fact that these events took place. This is how Philistine temples were made, with 2 pillars. You can see pictures. Go Google it. Don't do it now, unless you're really bored. but they're just right there. And if about 6 feet apart, and you can imagine that someone could stand there and push on them. And if you were strong enough, you could take down the whole house. So one archaeologist and Bible scholar, Brian Wood, he points out that the biblical account is written as if from an eyewitness. In particular, the words where it says in a second that he bows with all his strength, or leaned his weight against them and bowed with all his strength when we get there, that this is someone seeing him bending, and straining to push out those pillars. It's like seeing someone at the gym just straining and stretching to hit that personal best. Like, it's written like an eyewitness point of view. So my own, head version of this is maybe that boy who led Samson to the pillars. He survived to tell the tale, because it points out men and women there. I'm hoping this kid, I don't know if I should feel sorry for him, but I do, that led him to the pillars, that maybe he survived. He's one of the eyewitnesses. Complete conjecture, right? Complete conjecture. But this is written as if an eyewitness account. Here at the end, we're going to focus on two things about Samson. Samson uttering his final plea to God, and Samson making one last judgment as a judge. So, verse 28. Then Samson called to Yahweh and said, "O Lord Yahweh, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol and the tomb of Manoah his father. He had judged Israel 20 years. Samson gives a final plea, a prayer to God. To God. Now, Samson, for a judge, we only have 2 instances where he talks to God. He only talks about twice in the story. Gideon and others, they seem to have more of a dialogue or a little bit more interaction maybe. But there's 2 times that Samson talks to God, and they couldn't be more different. The first one is at the end of chapter 15. After he'd struck down all those thousands of Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, this is what he says. "You have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant, and shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" That's it. That's what he says. That's the first time he talks to God that we have recorded. And it's not a prayer. It's not anything, humble. And then this. I think when you compare him, you see the change of the man. The first time, it's rude and demanding. He doesn't say God. He doesn't say Lord. He doesn't say Yahweh. He doesn't say anything. It might as well be, "Hey, you. Are you going to let me die out here?" But the second time, the final time, what is it? "Oh, Lord Yahweh." You see G-O-D in capital letters. That means that's the personal covenant name of God. He addresses him both as the proper title for the sovereign, Adonai, Lord, but also that personal covenant name that he gave to Israel, Yahweh, that reminds him and the Israelites of his promise and his love. The first time, he doesn't request anything. He asks by way of accusation, right? "Hey, you going to let me die out here?" But the second time, Samson makes a request respectfully, politely. "Remember me," is a statement revealing his humility. He's not questioning God's memory. When you see in the Bible, "remember me," that's not insinuating that you forgot or that God forgot anything. What he's saying is he knows Samson does not deserve for God to even listen to him, to even consider him at all. Remember me is a plea for, I know I don't deserve it, but could you please just hear me this time? It's a pleading for God to once again put his eye on Samson to hear his prayer and his request. The first time Samson thinks he's the one doing God favors. Hey, you're going to let me die out here after everything I've done for you, after I killed all these Philistines, right? He's obviously not recognizing or acknowledging that the only reason he was able to defeat the Philistines was because of God's empowerment and strength. The second time, Samson asks for God's strength and power because he knows he can't do it on his own. And just for one last time. Now, it might seem like this last part about getting vengeance for his eyes seems like a selfish motive, almost like, Samson, are you just as self-absorbed, self-concerned as ever? I don't know that that's the case, given how the contrast, right, between the first time he's talking to the Lord and this time. It just seems so much more reverential and deferential to the Lord. I don't think all of a sudden he's trying to sneak in some personal motive, like buttering God up, and then, but what do I really want? Just vengeance for my eyes. I think this part of it's a word play. It's give me strength one more time for my two eyes, right? The one and the two kind of word play. Maybe there's a little bit of weird poetry. If you notice, Samson had a weird poetical sense. If you go back and look, and we've talked about this, I don't know if he was a good poet or not, but he liked to make little lyrics and rhymes and things like that. Doesn't seem to be very good. Maybe he's just doing something like that, but really, this isn't just about his eyes, which is cruel. I mean, just to gouge someone's eyes out, that is an incredibly cruel form of torture. But I think he's using his eyes to kind of sum up everything leading up to that moment. The Philistines took everything from him. The eyes are so precious. Even Jesus says, talks about the eye being the windows to the soul and things like that. The Philistines took everything from him. Delilah, whom he loved, betrayed him. Perhaps even the last thing he ever saw was Delilah there with his captors, and that's like the last image he saw. So I think the eyes is not just about, like, I need to get him back for taking my eyes, but I think it's, all that they have done to me, all that they have tried to do to thwart your purposes and plans, vengeance. And typically, I know you're saying, well, but still, vengeance belongs to the Lord, right? The Bible says to leave vengeance to God. But here's this thing, Samson is the judge. He is the one that's supposed to bring vengeance, recompense. That's his job. Samson is a judge, and he is the instrument of God's vengeance, just as all the other judges were. And it was part of his job to enforce God's law. And so there is a law, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. And so maybe that's another way to understand Samson's request. It's an acknowledgement that he was bringing judgment. He is the judge. He needs to bring judgment on the Philistines, eye for an eye. Now, they took two. So it's over and above the judgment that needs to come against him, if that makes sense. So his final plea to God is, in a way, to be a judge. And so Samson makes one last judgment. His one last judgment is in that phrase, let me die with the Philistines. And again, to contrast, the first time Samson talked to God, after he'd killed all those thousands, hey, you, are you going to let me die out here? Don't you know what I did for you? To sum it up. And he says, I'm going to die of thirst. Right? The first time he talked to him. Here we see a final request. Let me die. Let me die with the Philistines. First time is, are you going to let me die of thirst? This time is, let me die with the Philistines. That's the ending of the prayer, but it's also the last judgment he would ever make. And it's not just a judgment on the Philistines, is it? It's a judgment on himself. He deserved to share the same fate as the Philistines. A people he was supposed to defeat, but he ended up joining again and again, finding prostitutes and women in the land of the Philistines. Now he was going to join them in death. He was, in a sense, judging himself along with them. I deserve what they deserve. I am the judge that judges the Philistines, but he had the humility to judge himself. And so his limbs strain, his back flexes, the strong man is strong once more, but this time he does not strike any man directly. Instead, he takes down the very foundation of the Philistine leadership, the lords and all the people who were there. Samson is used by God. God answers the prayer one last time to do what he was supposed to do from the beginning, save Israel from the Philistines. One commentator writes this about this paradox of Samson. He says, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, the lead character says, "Give me that man who is not passion's slave." Samson, a man designed for great exploits, but with a legacy of uncontrollable lust and savage fits of temper. What paradox. Great physical strength, but just as great inner weakness. The paradoxes culminate at the end of his life. The deliverer is delivered to his enemies. God's chosen scourge is beaten and blinded. The practical joker becomes a joke for reveling Philistines. And finally, the dying Samson kills more Philistines than the living one. It's a sad statement for Samson, and yet almost poetic, his end, that he would end up judging himself. That's why this is not suicide, by the way, because some might say, well, is Samson committing suicide here? No, it is sacrifice. It is judgment, which he is allowed to make on himself. He deserved this penalty of death. It is not suicide. Samson then is returned to his home, the tomb of his father. And there's a few lessons, I think, or just a couple lessons that we can draw here at the close of Samson's life. Now, of course, classic tale of pride coming before fall. Samson is very notable as maybe one of the most arrogant men in the Bible, at least arrogant men that are believers. We know he's a believer because he is written of in Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Faith as being one of the faithful men of the Old Testament. And I think it's really all because of this last scene and this last moment. He screwed up a lot between his birth and this moment here. But he ended well, you could say. And that counts for a lot. Another lesson is that our failures shouldn't hinder us from crying out to God. If God's goal is humility, I don't think we need to be ashamed if that's what we've learned from our sin, failure, and weakness. We don't need to be ashamed of that which God used to teach us humility. That's hard sometimes. I'm not saying you got to blast all your insecurities to everyone, but I think the church should be kind of a safe place where we are not, or at least where we can tell the people not to be ashamed of the things that God used to build humility in us. I mean, he's treated very poorly here at the end of it. You could argue he deserved to have his eyes gouged out and all these things. But at the end of the day, I don't think he's ashamed of those things in heaven now, let's say, because God used those things to humble him. And if we can learn by it to avoid the same pitfalls, even better. I think Samson would be very pleased if we learn from his behavior. Lastly, we do see here a little glimpse of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because, like I said, this is not suicide, it is sacrifice. It is willing on the part of Samson to give up his life in order to finally do what God had called him to do, to defeat the Philistines. And so it is also that Jesus went willingly to the cross. He wasn't forced. He chose death. But the difference between suicide and sacrifice is that suicide is driven by the lie, everyone will be better off without me, I will take my life with me and go away. When in reality, it hurts and harms everyone who's left to deal with the aftermath. But sacrifice is driven by this truth. I will give my life away to others that they may live. And so Samson did. And so we can commend Samson for this. But if we can commend Samson for this, how much more can we commend that the perfect Son of Man and Son of God willingly went to the cross to bear our shame. Samson had a shame of his own when he did this. He judged himself. When Jesus went to the cross, he had no shame in himself. He had done nothing wrong. Instead, he chose to bear our shame, our sin, our punishment, and died on the cross that we might live. We do see a glimpse of the gospel here, even in the life of such one as Samson. Now, you and I, we're probably not quite as bad as Samson. No, I shouldn't say that. Sin is sin. And I don't know, maybe you're hiding stuff from me. Maybe we are as bad as Samson. But if God can redeem and use a Samson, if Samson can learn humility, guess what? So can you. You can be used by God no matter what you've done, no matter, even if you're even now suffering some of the punishment of things you've done wrong and the consequences of it. God can still use you. God has used many a Samson, and he does it purposefully to demonstrate his power and glory. If you're not a Christian this morning and you have any questions, or this afternoon, you have any questions about that, I'd love to talk to you about that. If you are a Christian this afternoon, I hope that you've learned something from the life of Samson that you can take with you this week. Maybe apply it to a situation, apply it to your heart.